Louisa Bennett arrived in the small Dakota Territory settlement of Ashford Flat in the spring of 1884 to take up a teaching post that 3 previous instructors had abandoned within a single term each, driven off, according to the school board's carefully worded advertisement, by the particular spiritedness of the local children. She had taught for 2 years in a considerably more orderly Ohio schoolhouse, before deciding, after her father's death left her with no remaining family obligations tying her east, that the frontier offered a fresh purpose worth the risk of its reputation. What the advertisement had not mentioned, because the school board considered it a private family matter rather than a professional concern, was that the single most difficult student in Ashford Flat was a grieving 9-year-old boy named Eli Pratt. Orphaned the previous winter when his parents died of influenza within days of each other, and now being raised by his uncle Jonah, a rancher 3 years widowed himself, who was doing his level best with a boy's grief that considerably exceeded his own experience with either children or comfort. Louisa's arrival, and everything that followed between her and Jonah Pratt over the coming months, would prove considerably more complicated and considerably more rewarding than either the school board's advertisement or Louisa's own modest expectations had prepared her for. This is the story of a schoolteacher who came to tame a schoolhouse full of restless frontier children, and found instead that the hardest lesson of her time in Ashford Flat belonged to a grieving boy and the lonely cowboy raising him. Louisa's first week at Ashford Flat's schoolhouse proceeded reasonably well by the modest standards the school board had led her to expect, until she encountered Eli Pratt directly on the 3rd morning, when the boy responded to a routine arithmetic correction by overturning his own desk and storming out of the schoolhouse entirely, leaving Louisa to manage a room of 22 startled children, while privately wondering whether the previous 3 teachers' rapid departures had rather more to do with this single boy than the school board's advertisement had suggested. She learned the fuller context that same afternoon from Opal Renshaw, the blacksmith's wife and Ashford Flat's most reliable source of settlement gossip, who explained Eli's circumstances with the particular gentleness reserved for genuinely sad stories. Lost both his parents to the influenza inside a week, poor lamb, and his uncle Jonah's been raising him since, doing right by the boy as best a bachelor rancher knows how, though grief that raw doesn't much care whether the man tending it knows the proper remedy, Opal said. The other teachers gave up on Eli quick, which only confirmed for the boy that he was as unmanageable as everyone already assumed. I'd wager patience would serve you considerably better than the correction methods your predecessors favored. Louisa took that counsel seriously, and rather than repeating her predecessor's approach of escalating discipline against a boy already convinced the world had proven itself unreliable, she began instead the slower work of earning Eli's trust through consistency rather than confrontation, staying late most evenings to tutor him privately when his temper had cooled enough to permit actual learning, and discovering, within those quiet afternoon sessions, a genuinely bright child whose anger masked a grief he had no other outlet for expressing. Jonah Pratt arrived at the schoolhouse one evening in early April, hat in hand and visibly uncomfortable with the errand, to apologize formally for Eli's overturned desk, and to inquire, with the particular awkwardness of a man unused to asking anyone for help, whether Louisa had any suggestions for managing a grief he confessed, plainly, that he felt entirely unequipped to address. I've raised cattle my whole life and buried a wife of my own 3 years back, and I thought I understood grief well enough to help the boy through his, Jonah said, standing just inside the schoolhouse door, as though uncertain of his welcome. Turns out, understanding my own grief and knowing how to guide a 9-year-old through his are 2 considerably different skills, and I've been failing at the second one worse than I'd like to admit. Louisa found herself unexpectedly moved by the plain honesty of the admission, having grown accustomed, in her limited experience with frontier men, to a reflexive pride that rarely permitted such direct acknowledgement of struggle. Eli's grief needs consistency and patience, considerably more than discipline, in my observation these past weeks, she said. He's testing whether the adults around him will abandon him the way circumstances already have, and every escalated punishment only confirms his fear rather than easing it. I've found, tutoring him privately in the evenings, that he responds considerably better to steady attention than to correction. You've been tutoring him privately, Jonah said, something in his weathered face softening at the news. Hadn't realized that, and I'm grateful for it more than I know how to properly express. Would it trouble you terribly if I asked what else, in your observation, might help a stubborn rancher do better by a grieving boy who deserves considerably more patience than I've managed to offer him so far? Horace Tilden, the school board's chairman, and a man who had never fully approved of hiring a young unmarried woman for the teaching post to begin with, called a formal board meeting in early May specifically to address what he termed the ongoing disruption of Eli Pratt's continued enrollment, proposing that the boy be removed from the schoolhouse entirely, and that Louisa's own continued employment be reconsidered given her apparent inability to maintain proper classroom discipline. Tilden's true motivation, as Louisa suspected though could not immediately prove, had considerably less to do with genuine concern for classroom order than with his preference for his own niece, recently arrived from Fargo with a teaching certificate, to take over the post instead. Louisa attended the board meeting prepared rather than defensive. Having spent the preceding week compiling careful records of Eli's genuine academic progress under her private tutoring, improved reading comprehension, steadily corrected arithmetic, and a marked reduction in disruptive incidents over the previous month, and presented the evidence to the assembled board members with a composure that visibly unsettled Tilden's confident expectation of an easy victory. Removing a grieving child from the one stable routine remaining in his life, based on incidents that have measurably decreased under patient management rather than punitive discipline, seems considerably more likely to harm this settlement's reputation than my continued employment ever could, Louisa said, addressing the full board rather than only Tilden. I would ask the board to weigh actual evidence of progress against Mr. Tilden's evident preference for a different candidate, rather than allowing personal considerations to masquerade as concern for classroom order. The board, several of whose members had daughters or sons who'd spoken warmly of Louisa's teaching, voted by a narrow margin to retain both Louisa and Eli, considerably to Tilden's visible frustration, though he made clear, in his parting remarks, that he intended to watch the situation closely for any further justification to revisit the matter. Reverend Elias Corwin, Ashford Flats' unmarried minister, and a man of considerable standing within the settlement's small society, began courting Louisa openly through the late spring, calling on her with the kind of formal, deliberate attention that made his intentions plain to the entire congregation within weeks, and pressing his suit with a confidence that assumed, not unreasonably given his position, that a schoolteacher of modest means would welcome a minister's steady prospects over any rougher alternative the settlement offered. Corwin made a point, on several occasions, of remarking pointedly on Jonah Pratt's frequent visits to the schoolhouse regarding Eli's progress, suggesting, with the particular condescension of a man secure in his own social standing, that a respectable teacher ought to be more careful about the appearance of familiarity with a rough widower rancher, however legitimate the pretext of the boy's education. Louisa found herself considerably more irritated by Corwin's presumption than flattered by his attention, and addressed the matter directly during one of his formal calls, rather than permitting the implication to stand unchallenged. Mr. Pratt's visits concern his nephew's education, a subject squarely within my professional responsibility, and I'd ask you not to imply impropriety in a matter that reflects considerably better on my dedication as a teacher than on any social calculation you're suggesting, Louisa said. I'll thank you to direct your courtship on its own merits, Reverend, rather than by disparaging a grieving family I've come to care for through my work. Corwin's composure faltered slightly at the directness of the rebuke, though he recovered enough to press his suit once more before finally departing, and Louisa found herself, watching him go, considerably more certain than she had been in weeks about precisely whose company she preferred among Ashford Flats' available suitors, even if she had not yet permitted herself to examine that preference too closely. Eli disappeared from Jonah's ranch on a warm evening in June, following a sharp argument in which Jonah, exhausted and out of patience after a difficult day, had spoken more harshly than he intended about the boy's continued struggles, and the resulting search, once Jonah realized Eli had run rather than simply hidden somewhere on the property, drew in nearly the whole settlement within the hour, lanterns bobbing across the dark prairie as searchers fanned out calling the boy's name into the warm June darkness. Louisa joined the search the moment word reached the schoolhouse, understanding Eli's likely state of mind better than most of the assembled searchers, and reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that a grieving boy fleeing a harsh word from the last family he had left would run toward comfort rather than away from it entirely. She found Eli 2 hours into the search at the small cemetery plot where his parents were buried, curled against his mother's headstone in the darkness, exhausted and shivering despite the warm night, having walked nearly 4 miles in his distress. She approached slowly, speaking softly rather than rushing to grab him, understanding that a frightened, grieving child needed gentleness considerably more than immediate correction. "Your uncle's frightened half to death looking for you," she said, settling onto the ground beside him, rather than looming over him. "I expect he said something in anger tonight that he didn't rightly mean, the way tired, worried people sometimes do. Would you like to tell me what happened, or would you rather I just sit here with you a while first?" Eli's composure finally broke entirely at the gentleness of the offer, and he cried for a long while against Louisa's shoulder, grief and exhaustion and fear all finally finding an outlet after months of being held rigidly in check. And it was there, in that dark cemetery, that Louisa finally understood the full depth of what this particular boy, and by extension his uncle, needed considerably more than discipline or even patient tutoring. Simple, steady presence, offered without conditions. Jonah found them shortly after, having followed the search party's shouts to the cemetery, and dropped to his knees beside Eli with a rawness of emotion he had carefully kept contained through 3 years of his own grief and months of struggling to parent a boy whose pain mirrored his own too closely for comfort. "I said something cruel tonight I didn't mean, Eli, and I've been sick with fear since you ran, that I might have said something unforgivable," Jonah said, pulling the boy into a fierce embrace. "I'm sorry, more sorry than I know how to say properly. You're not a burden to me, not for one single day since your folks passed, and I should have told you that plainly, considerably more often than I have." Louisa watched the reunion with tears of her own, understanding she was witnessing something considerably more significant than a simple resolved argument. A man finally breaking through his own careful containment, to offer the boy exactly the reassurance he'd needed since the day he lost his parents. When Jonah finally looked up at her, his weathered face still wet with unashamed tears, his gratitude carried a weight considerably beyond simple thanks for finding the boy. "You knew exactly where to look, and exactly how to approach him, in a way I've been failing to manage for months," Jonah said. "I don't know how to thank you properly for tonight, Miss Bennett, or for everything you've done for this boy since the day he overturned that desk." "You don't owe me thanks, Mr. Pratt," Louisa said. "Though I'll admit I've come to care for both of you considerably more than professional duty alone accounts for, and I find myself, watching you with him tonight, rather glad of exactly how much I've come to care." The months following that night in the cemetery brought a steady, unhurried change to Ashford Flat's understanding of Jonah Pratt's small family. As Eli's disruptions grew increasingly rare, and his genuine progress under Louisa's patient teaching became impossible for even Horace Tilden to dispute, and as Jonah's visits to the schoolhouse, once purely about his nephew's education, gradually and openly became about considerably more than that alone. Reverend Corwin, sensing correctly that his courtship had lost whatever ground it once held, redirected his attentions elsewhere within the settlement by midsummer, and Louisa found she did not miss his formal calls in the slightest. By the settlement's late summer picnic, held on the schoolhouse grounds with nearly the whole of Ashford Flat in attendance, Jonah and Louisa sat together openly on a shared blanket, while Eli ran with the other children in a game that required no adult supervision or careful management whatsoever, simply the ordinary, unremarkable joy of a boy who had, at last, found solid ground beneath him again. Opal Renshaw, watching the three of them from a neighboring blanket, remarked to her husband that she'd never seen a family come together quite so unexpectedly or quite so completely as this one had, out of grief and stubbornness, and one schoolteacher's patient refusal to give up on either a difficult boy or his lonely uncle. "I came to Ashford Flat expecting to tame a schoolhouse full of unruly frontier children," Louisa said that evening, watching Eli laugh freely across the picnic grounds. "And I find, looking back on the whole of this year, that the taming turned out to run considerably in the other direction. This settlement, and this particular family, taught me a good deal more than I ever managed to teach in return." "Don't sell yourself short," Jonah said, taking her hand plainly, in full view of the gathered settlement, without a trace of the awkwardness that had marked his first visit to her schoolhouse door. "You taught a grieving boy that the world hadn't finished offering him kindness, and you taught a lonely rancher considerably the same lesson, in your own patient way. Reckon that's worth a good deal more than any arithmetic lesson, however you measure it." And when Louisa smiled at that, warm and certain in the golden late summer light, Ashford Flat's whole gathered community understood, without needing it announced formally, exactly what kind of family had quietly taken root among them.